Greetings, friends. My name is Anna Nichenko, and now we will dive in the top news of this day. The head of the Chechen Republic, Ramzan Kadyrov, proposed introducing martial law in Russia. And according to Russian legislation, the upstart should already be imprisoned because in an aggressor country, one cannot call a war a war. For this, there is Newspeak special military operation. No war. Russians are peaceful people who simply bomb their neighboring country. But this is not a war, not terrorism, not genocide, not a desire to destroy everything Ukrainian. It's just a military operation. Russians do not confuse. In Ukraine, war. In Russia, SVO. By the way, Kadyrov made all these statements because of the attack by unknown drones on Moscow last night. But as Secretary of the Security Council of Ukraine, Alexei Danilov said, Kadyrov should take revenge on Moscow and Putin personally and not threaten Ukraine.
Kadyrov should take revenge on Moscow and Putin personally and not threaten Ukraine. It was the Russian who killed and annihilated Chechens. It was the Russian who brought centuries of slavery, thousands of murdered and tortured women and children, destroyed cities and desecrated graves of ancestors of Chechen soil. It was not Ukrainians who raised Grozny with its civilians to the ground with tanks. It was Russian tanks. The Chechen people remember this, and it's time for those who have forgotten to recall. Alexei Danilov, Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, on Twitter.
Just to remind you, on May 30th, unknown UAVs were spotted southwest of Moscow. Some of them caused minor damage to the infrastructure. It is unknown who exactly launched the drones. Presumably, these were the forces of resistance to the Putin's regime within Russia, whose activities are gaining serious momentum. The drone attack was aimed at the places of residence of the elite of Russia, Rublyovka, Novogoryova, Barvikha, Gorky, which caused a clear approval among ordinary Russians. The war unleashed by the Kremlin against Ukraine is returning to Russia. This is the natural and fair result of aggression. The action in Moscow and the suburbs shook the feeling of impunity among the Russians. The Russian air defense is not ready to defend its skies because its air defense systems S-300, S-400 are used for a missile attack on Ukrainian cities and villages. The remnants of air defense protect the power elite. The Kremlin has no moral right to talk about terrorism after it's launched a terrorist campaign against Ukrainian cities and villages, having killed hundreds of civilians. Preparations are underway for the organization of the Peace Summit. No other country in the world wants peace like Ukraine. It is to achieve peace that the efforts of Ukrainian diplomacy and the military are aimed. Ukraine needs a real peace, a just and lasting one, not a temporary respite before a new escalation. The Ukrainian peace formula is the only realistic way to peace, based on the norms of international law and supported by the resolution of the United Nations General Assembly. As this war is taking place on Ukrainian soil, the Ukrainian peace plan must be at the center of any peacemaking efforts. Ukraine calls on all peace-loving countries of the world to actively participate in the implementation of the peace formula.
Now in Ukraine, on our land, in our sky, it's been decided whether freedom and civilization will retain global leadership in this century. Decided by us, together with America, together with Europe, together with all our allies and partners. I thank everyone in the world who help us.
Each country can take the lead in promoting one of the 10 points of the formula. The items of Ukraine's peace formula are supported by relevant United Nations General Assembly resolutions and are fully compliant with international law and the United Nations Charter. Ukraine observes a variety of peace efforts by foreign leaders and countries. At the same time, we emphasize that Ukraine's peace formula remains the only realistic way to achieve a just and lasting peace in Ukraine and the world in the future. The G7 summit in Hiroshima, with the participation of President Volodymyr Zelensky, supported the Ukrainian peace formula. During the G7 summit in Hiroshima, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres stated that the United Nations Security Council did not fulfill its main functions, for which it had been created. The flaw of the system of international security is that a state that does not consider international law has emergency powers within the United Nations Security Council and has unleashed the largest war in Europe since 1945. The statement of the United Nations Secretary General testifies to the awareness of the problems that Kyiv has long been declaring at the highest level. Perhaps it is this war that will lead to the restructuring of the global security architecture, turning it into a more modern and effective one. At least 300 billion euros of Russian assets have been seized in Western countries. Polish President Andrzej Duda proposed to transfer these funds to Ukraine. Russian aggression has caused enormous losses to Ukraine, and all Russian assets abroad can compensate for only part of these losses. Russia systematically violates the right of ownership in the occupied territories of Ukraine. Therefore, it has no moral right to appeal to its own right of ownership elsewhere. For many years, Russia has used its financial resources to strengthen its influence and business positions in Western countries to wage a hybrid war. If the Kremlin manages to unblock access to its frozen assets, they will not be used to compensate for the losses, but to continue the aggression and genocide of Ukrainians. The decision of the U.S. Attorney General to transfer the confiscated assets of the Russians oligarch Malafeyev for the reconstruction of Ukraine is the first such precedent and an example for other countries to follow. According to the second Ukraine Rapid Damage and Needs Assessment Note report developed by the World Bank Group, the government of Ukraine, the European Commission, and the United Nations, the first year of war has resulted in almost $290 billion of aggregate economic, social, and other monetary loss, about $411 billion in total reconstruction and recovery needs. Considering that the war is not over, the final numbers may be much higher. So, as we can see, even the frozen assets may not be enough to compensate for the losses already incurred. Therefore, we should think not only about how Ukraine will rebuild, but also about how to stop the war that causes doom. That concludes today's video. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for future videos. Goodbye.